The days in the station had become as pale and featureless as the snow itself, a slow attrition of hours marked only by the rhythms of routine, the whine of the generator, the soft crunch of boots along the insulated corridors, the distant, ceaseless thrum of wind against the reinforced walls, as if some vast, indifferent hand was testing the strength of our outpost one gust at a time. Most mornings, I would wake before the alarm, the cold already finding ways to reach through layers of blankets and clothing, reminding me that comfort here was always provisional, something easily stolen by the elements or by a slip in protocol. Our drill schedule had not changed in weeks at 0600. We gathered in the comms room, logs were checked, sensor readouts verified, and then, like clockwork, we fanned out across the site to inspect each checkpoint above and below the surface. The silence beneath the ice was always oppressive, broken only by the static of the radios or the crackle of ice settling, that vast groaning language that sometimes sounded eerily close to human speech. It was my turn to take the South Tunnel, the one least favored by the others, for its length and for the way the light from the surface faded after only a dozen meters, plunging everything into a blue-black twilight where your breath always seemed too loud. I remember feeling, as I descended, the peculiar weight of solitude, a sense of being watched, not by anything living but by the ice itself's centuries of pressure, secrets layered in frozen strata, and the echo of all the voices that had come before mine, hopeful, anxious, or desperate. My boots skidded once on a patch of frost, sending a tremor through my body, adrenaline spiking for no reason I could name. And then the radio on my chest sputtered, a crackle, a burst of static, and then something else, a tone, impossibly low, resonant, not part of any protocol or device I recognized. For a moment, I thought it was just the machinery, one of those artifacts of cold that made the instruments sing in strange ways. But as I paused at checkpoint Delta 7, the sound grew louder, resolving into a rhythm. It pulsed a kind of seismic heartbeat, and when I called it in, there was a hesitation on the line before control answered. "Repeat that last, Delta 7. I described the noise, its unsteady cadence, and they told me to record it, to stay put and wait for instructions. I felt exposed there, the tunnel a ribcage of frozen water, and my own breath clouding around my face like a second mask. I pressed the microphone against the wall, the cold biting even through my gloves, and the sound deepened, a signal buried beneath the static, like something calling from under miles of ice. I tried to focus on the procedures, the checklist for anomalous sensor data, the redundant systems we'd drilled 100 times, but my hands were shaking as I filed the report. The others met me at the junction, faces drawn tight with a caution that bordered on fear, though no one said the word. We replayed the recording together in the mess later, and the mood in the station changed. No one could explain it, not even Dr. Halvorsen, who prided herself on skepticism, whose voice was now softer, stripped of its usual edge. She said the frequency didn't match any known source, and it seemed to shift if you listened too long, rising and falling like breath. That night, the wind was especially fierce, scraping its fingers along the metal siding, and I lay awake, listening to the building groan, hearing the echo of that signal in the silence. The next morning, protocol dictated we repeat the drill, but the usual certainty was gone. Every movement was cautious, every radio check heavy with anticipation. The ice was never truly silent again after that, not in the tunnels, not in the labs, not even in the warmth of the common room. Something had shifted, a fracture in our routines, and as the days crept forward, I found myself listening for that pulse in the background of every conversation, every gust of wind, every dream. It was as if the ice itself had exhaled, and in that breath, something old had woken up and started watching us back. We tried to convince ourselves, in the days that followed, that the signal was just another aberration, some quirk of electromagnetic interference, or a glitch in the sensor grid that ran like arteries beneath the station. But nothing quite settled after that first recording. The routines, once a shield against the monotony and dread of our isolation, became a kind of superstition, a collective denial held together by nervous laughter and the careful avoidance of certain topics. It was Dr. Halvorsen who pushed for a new scan of the southern quadrant, arguing that even if it was nothing, we owed it to the grant money, to the station, and, unspoken, to the sanity of everyone sleeping above miles of shifting ice. On the morning of the survey, the sun was a weak smudge behind a canvas of grey, and the air inside the main module felt thick with tension. The plan was simple: send a pair of drones down the ice-bored tunnels to triangulate the source of the anomaly, cross-reference it with old survey maps, and, if needed, mark the data for a more thorough scan. I was tasked with monitoring the readings while Dr. Halvorsen and Wheeler ran the surface controls. The whir of the drone motors sounded oddly alive in the silence, echoing off the ice in nervous bursts. For a while, it was just the familiar monotony of numbers and static, the same endless lists of depth, density, temperature, interspersed with the click and hiss of the machines adjusting to pressure changes. But at 128 meters, the drone's LiDAR registered a break in the uniformity of the glacier, a pocket, irregular and vast, that should not have been there. At first, we thought it was a simple miscalculation, some void left by an old melt or an artifact from a previous expedition. But as the drone descended and its camera resolved the darkness into form, a hush fell over the combs. The cavity was enormous, larger than any subglacial chamber in our records, and there was a geometry to it that made the eye hesitate, curvatures and angles that defied the careless curves of natural erosion. A vault of ice marked by fractures too regular, as if something had once pressed outward, then receded. The drone's floodlights caught on striations in the walls, layers of sediment and ancient air bubbles preserved like ghosts in the blue. But deeper still, the camera showed shadows that refused to clarify, darkness that seemed to pulse in rhythm with that low signal still echoing faintly on our instruments. I radioed Dr. Halvorsen, my voice thin and brittle as she toggled the feed to full spectrum. The drone's sensors began to spike, temperature dropping, magnetic readings oscillating in a slow, unnatural wave. Wheeler suggested a mechanical fault, but no one believed it not really. The second drone was sent in, its searchlight playing across the uneven floor, illuminating a field of crystal spires jutting from the cavern's heart like the ribs of some colossal carcass. Between them, the ice was clearer, older, almost translucent, and behind that ancient glass lay forms indistinct, shifting as if underwater. We argued, quietly and urgently, about what we were seeing, the words tumbling over one another as if naming it would somehow make it safe. There was talk, half serious, about abandoning the scan, marking the cavern as unstable, logging the data and retreating behind procedures. But curiosity, or fear, or some blend of the two, kept us watching as the drone's lights probed the shadows. The signal, that pulse, was louder now, no longer masked by the static of machinery. It seemed to emanate from the very core of the cavern, a resonance that set our teeth on edge. Dr. Halvorsen, always skeptical, was the first to suggest a direct exploration, arguing that the anomaly was too significant to ignore, too strange to be left unexplored. The debate that followed was hushed but fierce, the logic of science warring with the primal sense that we had stumbled onto something meant to remain undisturbed. In the end, it was the data that decided for us. The readings were too anomalous to be dismissed, the void too precise, too improbable to be natural. We spent the rest of the day preparing, assembling gear and logging our intentions with the base, each step a ritual against the growing sense of foreboding. As night fell, the wind outside picked up, battering the station with sheets of ice and snow that rattled the windows and masked the usual sounds of the night. I lay awake, unable to shake the memory of the drone's footage, the way the lights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness at the center of the chamber. The next morning, 3 of us descended the main access shaft, ice axes and radios slung across our backs, lights cutting narrow corridors through the blue gloom. The way down was slower than usual, the ice thicker, less forgiving, every footstep echoing in a way that felt unnatural, as if the glacier itself was listening. The tunnel forked where the LiDAR had mapped the void, and we paused, the air colder, thinner, every breath harsh in our lungs. The wall here was smoother than it should have been, polished by a process none of us could name, and as we drilled the first core sample, the auger jerked unexpectedly, slipping free as the ice gave way to empty air. We widened the breach carefully, chipping at the edges until the hole was large enough to shine a light through. What we saw defied any expectation, any explanation. The cavern yawned beneath us, larger than we had imagined, a cathedral of frost and darkness, the ceiling lost in shadow. Stalactites glittered overhead, dripping with ancient water, and below, the floor was littered with the remains of what looked like machinery, twisted, corroded, fused with the ice itself. It was as if something had been here before us, something that had tried and failed to escape the glacier's slow, inexorable grip. Our voices sounded small, irrelevant, as we debated what to do next. The signal was louder here, a physical pressure against our ears and chests, and every so often, a vibration ran through the walls, subtle but unmistakable, as if the glacier was breathing or waiting. We documented what we could, snapped photographs and collected samples, but the atmosphere inside the cavern was charged, oppressive, a sense of being unwelcome and observed. Dr. Halvorsen insisted on further investigation, her hands trembling slightly as she recalibrated the equipment. Wheeler stayed by the rope, eyes fixed on the shadows at the edge of the light. I found myself drawn toward the center of the chamber, where the ice was thinner, clearer, the signal almost deafening in my head. I pressed my gloved hand to the surface, felt a chill that went deeper than cold, something that vibrated up my arm and settled in my bones. For a moment, I thought I saw movement beneath the surface, something dark, shifting, pressed close to the ice as if listening. I recoiled, heart pounding, and called the others. We marked the coordinates, set up remote sensors, and retreated, the silence behind us somehow thicker than before. Back at the station, we tried to make sense of what we had seen. The footage was inconclusive, the readings off the charts. But none of us slept well that night, haunted by the knowledge that the ice was not empty, that something had shaped it, and that whatever lay beneath was not content to remain hidden. The station, once a sanctuary of reason and routine, felt suddenly fragile, a thin shell above a darkness we had only begun to understand. We began our preparations for a proper descent into the cavern as the sky outside the station faded from its pale, reluctant daylight into the kind of polar twilight that blurs hours into a single, slow-crawling dusk. The equipment felt heavier than usual, straps digging into shoulders and gloves clumsy with the bulk of extra insulation. The radio hissed with static, not quite masking the tension among us. We spoke in clipped voices, as if trying not to attract attention, though from what, none of us could say. By the time our final checks were finished, my breath already fogged thick in the air. Every inhale tinged with that metallic bite of cold and something sharper, some subtle note of anticipation or dread. Dr. Halvorsen was the first through the breach, her headlamp slicing the dark, casting wild, wandering shadows along the ice-rimmed walls. Wheeler followed, fussing over the sensor rig, his attempts at humor falling flat in the thin, echoing air. I was last, knees braced as I lowered myself through the opening. Every movement amplified by the creak of harnesses and the soft, crystalline clatter of falling frost. The cavern was even larger than our first glimpses had suggested, the light from our lamps swallowed quickly by the vast, hollow blackness. Our voices bounced off the walls in strange, distorted echoes, returning to us warped and distant. There was an odd geometry to the chamber, a quality that unsettled the eye. Surfaces that seemed smooth from one angle revealed themselves, jagged from another. Lines curved in on themselves, merging, splitting, as if the ice had grown in the grip of forces that obeyed no logic we understood. Stalactites hung in great, heavy clusters, their tips sharp and gleaming like ancient daggers, while beneath our boots the floor was littered with crystals unlike any I'd seen before. Tall, hexagonal spires that caught the light and fractured it, painting restless patterns on the ceiling. We moved slowly, careful to document every detail. Dr. Halvorsen kept up a running commentary for the recorder, voice hushed, almost reverent, while Wheeler set up seismic probes at regular intervals. My own attention was drawn repeatedly to the center of the cavern, where the ice was thinner and clearer, the forms beneath it shadowy and elusive. There was something, their indistinct shapes, darker than the rest, as if the glacier itself was trying to smother or contain them. We took samples of the ice, chipping away careful fragments and sealing them in sterile tubes. Each tap of the pick echoed with a strange, almost musical quality, the pitch rising and falling as if in answer to the unseen pulse that still vibrated, faint but insistent, in the air. As I knelt to examine one of the crystal spires, I noticed something odd. Trapped inside the mineral, perfectly preserved, was a coil of wire, corroded nearly to nothing, and beside it, a shard of what looked like glass or plastic, scored with symbols that made no sense. I called Halvorsen over, and she crouched beside me, breath quickening as she realized what it was. Not natural, she whispered, not anything the ice could have created on its own. The realization settled between us, heavy as a confession. We were not the first to enter this place, or perhaps not the first to try. The feeling of being observed intensified, a prickling along the back of my neck, as if the shadows themselves were aware of our intrusion. Wheeler's voice crackled over the radio, calling us over to a low ridge at the far end of the cavern. His probe had picked up a void beneath the ice, a hollow space that defied the expected strata. We gathered around, lights playing over the surface, and I saw them lines carved into the floor, patterns geometric and precise, their meaning lost to time but their intent unmistakable. Dr. Halvorsen traced them with a gloved finger, her voice barely above a whisper. This was constructed, she said, or at least shaped. But by what, and for what purpose, no one could say. We spread out, searching for more evidence. And it was Wheeler who found the next anomalous series of metal rods embedded deep in the wall, rusted but unmistakably machined, leading upward and out of sight. We photographed everything, took measurements, samples, desperate to impose order on the chaos of impressions. But the longer we remained, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, the pressure in the air mounting until even breathing felt like an act of defiance. As we worked, the pulse that had haunted our instruments grew stronger, no longer a background hum but a presence, tangible and insistent, as if it was responding to our movements. Dr. Halvorsen's recorder flickered, the audio distorting, capturing snatches of sound that made no sense. Clicks, groans, the suggestion of distant voices whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. The temperature dropped further, frost feathering our lenses and crystals forming on our clothing. Wheeler's hands began to shake, his jokes replaced by silence. He glanced at me, eyes wide, and I knew he felt it too, that sense of trespass, of having gone too far. Still, we pressed on, compelled by a mix of scientific curiosity and something deeper, an unspoken need to understand what we had awakened. We followed the metal rods to a narrow fissure in the wall, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Beyond it, a secondary chamber opened up, smaller but even more disturbing in its regularity. The walls here were scored with marks, not random but deliberate, a language etched by hands or tools we could not imagine. In the center of the chamber, encased in a block of perfectly clear ice, was an object impossible to define, both mechanical and organic, its shape shifting in the uncertain light. Dr. Halvorsen stared at it for a long time, her breath fogging the surface as she muttered to herself, cataloguing, speculating, reaching for explanations that refused to come. I watched her face, saw the struggle between fear and wonder, and felt both reflected in myself. Wheeler backed away, muttering about getting the data topside, about needing to regroup and analyze. But as we started to retreat, a deep, resonant sound rolled through the cavern, vibrating in the very marrow of our bones, and every lamp flickered, casting the chamber into strobing shadow. The pulse on our instruments spiked, nearly overwhelming the senses, and in the chaos, I thought I saw movement in the eye shapes, twisting, pressing closer, as if drawn by our presence. We scrambled back the way we came, breathed loud in our ears, every footstep pursued by that echoing resonance. When we finally emerged into the main cavern, the sense of relief was tempered by a new understanding. The glacier was not merely a container, not simply an accidental tomb, but something shaped by intention, by purpose. The formations we had found were proof of that, a message or a warning left by whatever intelligence had passed this way before. Back at the station, we reviewed the footage, the samples, the data, but nothing matched any known pattern or material. Dr. Halvorsen was subdued, withdrawn, poring over the symbols in silence. Wheeler became obsessed with the recordings, isolating fragments of sound, convinced there was a code hidden within the pulses. As for me, I could not shake the image of that shifting form in the ice, the sense that it was waiting, listening, perhaps even dreaming. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, and the sky pressed low and grey, sealing us in with our discoveries and our fear. The station, once a refuge from the cold, now felt like just another cell in the glacier's vast, unyielding prison. And I wondered not for the last time what it was we had truly found, and what would happen now that it knew we were here. After our initial foray into the cavern, the station became a place divided between silence and obsession. Even the most mundane chores were now tinged with apprehension, our minds never fully leaving the shadows beneath the ice, the metallic taste of that hidden chamber lingering on the tongue like blood. Days blurred together in the sickly light of polar winter. Wheeler barely slept, poring over the sensor data, muttering half-coherent theories about magnetic anomalies and coded pulses. Dr. Halvorsen, usually so disciplined and precise, turned almost feverish in her pursuit of meaning, sketching the geometric patterns we'd found on every spare scrap of paper, her notes a growing labyrinth of speculation and warning. I felt suspended between them, the intermediary, haunted by the memory of those shifting forms and the chill that had burrowed deeper than mere cold. It was Halvorsen who insisted we mount a second, more focused expedition, this time equipped with heavier drills, chemical samplers, and a new portable radar. "If there's something in that ice," she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with a terrible anticipation, "we need to see it up close." We set out again at dawn, or what passed for dawn in that liminal place. The world outside our little refuge, a uniform field of blue and grey. Our movements had taken on a ritual quality. Every step weighted with the certainty that the glacier was watching, that the darkness beneath was listening. We descended, one by one, into the gaping wound we had opened in the ice. Each meter gained a small triumph over the urge to turn back. The light from our headlamps seemed weaker now, swallowed by the cavern's impossible geometry, as if even photons struggled to escape. We reached the secondary chamber with our nerves taut and raw, the object still sealed in its glacial sarcophagus. This time, Halvorsen took the lead, hands steady as she arranged the gear round the ice block, her breath blooming and fading on its surface. She set up the radar, adjusting its frequency until the returns were sharp, detailed, almost three-dimensional. What emerged from those scans was stranger than any of us had dared imagine. The thing encased there was both familiar and wholly alien, a hybrid of bone and alloy, its structure at once biological and mechanical. Tendrils, or perhaps cables, wound through the ice, branching and dividing in fractal patterns that mimicked nerve endings or root systems, terminating in clusters of nodules, some of which seemed to pulse faintly with their own dim, interior light. Embedded along one side was what looked like a segment of vertebrae, but the proportions were all wrong, the symmetry impossible, as if evolution itself had followed a different path down here in the dark. Wheeler scanned the outer layer with his magnetometer, and the needle jumped wildly, readings fluctuating in a rhythm eerily similar to the pulses that had drawn us here in the first place. Halvorsen recorded everything, speaking in clipped, formal phrases, but I could hear the edge of awe in her voice, driven by a mixture of scientific rigor and something more primal curiosity. Maybe, or that old, unspoken fear of the unknowns. She decided we should try to extract a sample from the block. She prepared the thermal drill, its tip glowing cherry red in the cold, and began to bore carefully into the clear ice, stopping every few centimeters to allow Wheeler to test for structural integrity. The drill's vibrations seemed to resonate through the chamber, stirring echoes in the walls, as if the glacier itself objected to this violation. A sudden crack rang out, sharp as a gunshot, and for an instant, I thought the ice would shatter, entombing us alongside whatever ancient secret we had awakened. But the fracture held, and Halvorsen carefully inserted a thin, flexible probe into the gap. The camera feed displayed on her monitor showed layers upon layers of frost and mineral deposits. Then, abruptly, a surface smooth metallic, covered in what looked like crystalline growths, some of which twitched ever so slightly in response to the probe's light. Wheeler jerked back from the screen, face pale beneath the grime, but Halvorsen leaned in, eyes wide with an intensity I had never seen before. She directed the probe along the structure, past a web of organic filaments that pulsed with an almost vascular rhythm, until it caught on something, a fragment of fabric, impossibly old, its weave unlike any modern material. The probe's sensors detected traces of protein, carbon, and something else, a compound that resisted analysis, its signature spiking off the charts. Halvorsen withdrew the probe and sealed the sample tube, her hands shaking only after the work was done. "It's not dead," she whispered, more to herself than to us. Or it wasn't, not all the way. This thing, whatever it is, it was alive, or part of something alive, when it froze. Back at the station, we analyzed the sample, running it through every scanner and spectrometer we had. The organic material yielded no familiar sequences, no recognizable DNA, only a series of repeating motifs that suggested intelligence, purpose, or design. The metallic shards embedded in the ice bore traces of isotopes not found in any known terrestrial alloy, their surface etched with microscopic grooves that, under magnification, resembled circuitry or script. The more we learned, the less we understood. Halvorsen became convinced the thing was a remnant of an ancient civilization, lost beneath the ice long before our own kind ever set foot here. Wheeler, shaken, muttered darkly about contamination, about what might happen if we brought something up that was never meant to thaw. That night, as the wind battered the station and the temperature dropped even lower, I dreamed of the Kavanov, its impossible geometry, its whispering shadows, the thing in the ice uncoiling, stretching, waking. I heard the pulse, louder now, not just in the instruments but in my own bones, an insistent rhythm that called to me in my sleep. I awoke, drenched in sweat, the sense of being watched so intense that I checked every lock, every hatch, every corner of the station before I could force myself to return to bed. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, erasing all tracks, all evidence of our presence. Inside, we three huddled over our data, prisoners of our own discovery, each of us beginning to sense, in different ways, that we had trespassed not just on a hidden chamber, but on the boundary between what is known and what is forbidden. The following morning, Halvorsen proposed a radical new hypothesis. The pulses, she argued, were a signal, a kind of distress beacon or alarm triggered by our intrusion. The thing in the ice was not only ancient, but sentient, or had been capable of reaching out, even in dormancy, across the gulf of millennia. Wheeler dismissed her theory, but his hands shook as he calibrated the equipment for another round of tests. I said nothing, but privately, I believed her. The patterns in the ice, the symbols, the strange, insistent rhythm, all pointed to something alive, something with intent, a presence so vast and old that the mind recoiled from contemplating it. We resolved, reluctantly, to leave the chamber sealed for a day, to gather our thoughts and await instructions from Central Command, though none of us truly expected an answer from the outside world anymore. As we sat in the common room that night, staring at the flickering light of the comms console and listening to the ceaseless wind, the pulse began again, louder, more insistent, echoing through the walls and into our chests. I thought of the thing in the ice, trapped and dreaming, and wondered not for the first time if some doors, once opened, can ever truly be closed again. The sense of something ancient and inexorable pressing up from below was inescapable, and I understood, with a clarity that chilled me more than the cold ever could, that our presence here was not an accident, nor a discovery, but an invitation to something that had waited a very long time for company in the dark. The station was never truly dark, not even at midnight, not even in the long polar winter when the sun abandoned us for months at a stretch and the world outside was little more than an unbroken scrawl of blue and shadow. There was always the low, sourceless glow of LEDs from monitoring panels and laptops, the lazy sweep of the emergency beacon circling the comms tower outside, the soft red pulse of the heater core light. But as our days grew more consumed by the mystery beneath the ice, the nights grew heavier, thick with the sense that the darkness pressing in at the windows was more than just the absence of light, was a presence, patient and waiting, the kind that made you flinch at every creak of the walls or thump of the wind. I drew the short straw that night, tasked with the midnight watch, a ritual meant to soothe as much as to protect, though nobody would admit that aloud anymore. Wheeler was asleep on the bunk below mine, snoring lightly, a tangle of blankets hiding his twitching limbs. Dr. Halvorsen had set up camp at the lab bench, face-washed in the blue light of her tablet, endlessly reviewing scan results and comparing them to the sketches she'd begun pinning up around the station's strange glyphs. Angular spirals, the fractured symmetry of an alien language that haunted even the back of my eyelids when I closed them. At midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, the air in the common room growing brittle and thin, the kind that turns your breath to needles. I bundled myself in my thickest coat and made the rounds. Flashlight playing across the frosted glass and the stacks of supply crates that had begun to feel more like barricades than provisions. The world outside the windows was indistinguishable from the reflection of my own face, a pale ghost floating in the void, mouth slightly open as if caught in the act of listening. I checked each hatch, each vent, each narrow service corridor with the diligence of a man who has no other choice. Fingers trailing along cold metal and rough plastic, ears straining for the sound of anything out of place. It was on the southern side, just above the access tunnel we had opened to the cavern, that I heard it, a low, dragging scrape, so soft I might have mistaken it for the wind if not for the pattern. The strange deliberation in each pause, each shift. I froze, heart pounding, counting the seconds between movements, forcing myself to breathe as I thumbed the radio and whispered for Halvorsen to join me. She arrived quickly, her eyes wide and shining with something I could not quite name fear. Yes, but also something closer to hunger. We listened together in the narrow passage, shoulder to shoulder, both holding our breath as the scraping came again. This time closer, more urgent, as if something was testing the boundaries of the world we had made for ourselves. Halvorsen reached for her portable thermal scanner, waving it slowly across the bulkhead, but the screen returned only static, a field of swirling colors and impossible temperatures. The scraping paused, then started again, this time from beneath our feet, a slow, circling spiral that echoed the glyphs on her papers. The radio on my belt hissed and crackled, then sputtered out a burst of sound that was almost but not quite words, as if someone or something was trying to speak but lacked the right mouth, the right shape. We stared at each other in the dim light, then at the door to the tunnel below. Neither of us wanted to be the first to suggest what came next, but in the end, it was Halvorsen who insisted we check the access shaft, arguing that any failure to log movement in the vicinity of the cavern could be catastrophic for the data. Together, we descended, the thick hush of the lower corridors pressing in on us, amplifying every sound until our own footsteps seemed to mock us. The air down there was colder, even with the heaters running, the kind of cold that seems to swallow your voice before it leaves your lips. The ice around the tunnel mouth was sweating, beads of moisture forming and running in trembling lines. Along the seams where our drills had widened the passage, we stood there for a long time, listening, watching as the beam of my flashlight jittered across the rough walls. Halvorsen moved to check the seismic sensor logs. She was the most methodical of us, her hands only shaking a little now as she scrolled through line after line of numbers. Then she stiffened, breath hitching as she passed me the display. The readings showed movement, not just a single point, but a slow, rolling wave, like something huge stirring just beneath the surface, sending vibrations through the whole glacier. We watched the graphs spike and fall in perfect, mocking rhythm with the pulse we had been tracking all week, the same unnatural heartbeat that haunted the cavern and our dreams. Wheeler appeared at the top of the tunnel, blinking sleep from his eyes and grumbling about protocol, but the look on his face when he saw the data killed any further protest. He joined us in silence, the three of us huddled together in the blue glow of the screen, the night around us thick with the weight of the unknown. It was Wheeler who finally spoke, voice dry and thin. Maybe it's just the glacier shifting, but no one believed it. Not really, not after all we had seen and heard. I tried to record the sound, holding my phone out toward the tunnel mouth, but the audio came back warped and distorted, heavy with a kind of inhuman resonance that seemed to vibrate the fillings in my teeth. The night wore on, endless, each hour stretching into the next until I lost track of time, my sense of self fraying at the edges. Outside, the wind howled and rattled the station, but inside, The world had shrunk to a single point, the tunnel. The data, the slow, deliberate scraping that moved from place to place, like an animal learning the boundaries of its cage. Sometimes the sound would vanish for minutes at a time, and we would sag with relief, only for it to start up again somewhere else, always closer, always more certain. Halvorsen began writing equations in the frost on the inside of the window, trying to find patterns in the madness, while Wheeler retreated to the lab to review the radar footage from earlier that day. I stayed at my post, eyes fixed on the narrow entrance to the tunnel, knuckles white around the handle of the emergency flare gun, not sure if I was more afraid of seeing something emerge or of hearing the scraping simply stop. Just before dawn, the sensors went quiet, the pulse on the instruments fading to nothing, the temperature in the station dropping a full 5 degrees in a single, impossible instant. Halvorsen and Wheeler joined me at the common room window, all three of us watching the horizon, searching for any sign of movement in the endless blue. The world outside was unchanged, blank and silent, but I knew better. We all did. Whatever was beneath the ice was moving, learning, searching for cracks in our defenses, cracks in our resolve. I watched the snowdrift and swirl, my own reflection hollow-eyed and haunted in the glass, and knew that the station had become something else in the night, not a fortress, not even a sanctuary, but a beacon, a flare of warmth and life above an ancient, restless cold. We slept fitfully, when we slept at all, each of us taking turns at the window, listening for sounds that could not possibly exist, marking the hours by the slow, relentless crawl of whatever moved beneath our feet, closer and closer with every breath, every heartbeat, every dream we dared not remember come morning. From the moment the movement in the ice became more than theory, became noise, became proof, became the unsleeping rhythm beneath every footfall in the station, the boundaries between surface and depth, between certainty and the relentless crawl of doubt, began to dissolve. There were days when the routine still held, or seemed to. Coffee boiled over in the little galley, reports compiled and filed on the battered terminals, sensor logs reviewed until our eyes burned and our hands cramped from scribbling frantic annotations in the margins. But the ordinary rituals only emphasized what had changed. No one really spoke of it, not in daylight, not while the radio still carried its thin trickle of static from the world beyond. But the truth was there in the way we all drifted toward the windows, the way we paused in the doorways and stared out across the blue plain, searching for anything, any movement, any crack, any shadow where only white should be. In the hours after the night of scraping, the glacier itself seemed to shift in mood, the stillness of the landscape replaced by a kind of pressure, as if the weight of millennia had somehow lightened, or been breached, or been allowed to breathe for the first time in an age. The first crack was discovered by Wheeler, out at the southern marker, his boots crunching through a dust of fresh snow, instrument pack slung across his back, muttering about recalibrating the sensors one more time before the cold ate through the batteries. He was gone longer than usual, and when he returned, cheeks flushed and breath steaming in the bitter air, he held his gloves in one hand and a sample jar in the other, frost already blooming on the glass. "Found something," he said, voice clipped, eyes darting past me to the corridor behind, as if expecting someone or something to follow. He laid the jar on the table, unscrewed the lid, and tipped the contents into the tray under the dissecting microscope. A length of ice, translucent and filigreed with hairline fissures, some old, some alarmingly new. But it was what lay inside that drew Halvorsen and me close, shoulders bumping as we stared down. A strand of dark material, organic, knotted in impossible loops, embedded deep in the core of the sample. Halvorsen took the tweezers, hands steady for once, and teased the strand out. It resisted, stretching, almost flexing, before snapping with a sound like a plucked wire. The fragment lay on the table, stubbornly refusing to thaw, its surface already glistening with a fresh layer of frost, as if the cold itself had become animate, alive, resistant to the touch. The following morning brought a new sound, subtler than the scraping but more insidious, a chorus of soft, intermittent pops that began somewhere below the generator room and spread outward, echoing through the ducts and vents, mimicked and multiplied by the ice. I charted the noises on a hastily drawn map, marking each report, each tremor, and watched as the pattern emerged in arc radiating outward from the southern cavern, lines of weakness forming along old seams, ancient layers forced apart by the pressure of something relentless and unyielding. The cracks, at first confined to the southern approach, began to appear elsewhere, winding along the access shaft, threading their way beneath the solar array, crawling toward the station itself as if drawn by heat, by movement, by the promise of life behind glass and steel. Halvorsen set up an array of geophones, wiring the outputs into the main comms console, so we could listen to the glazier's song in real time, a symphony of fracture and groan, of things unsealing and shifting in the deep. We listened for hours, transfixed by the layers of sounder language that was not ours, a warning, a plea, or something older and less human, echoing up from the uncharted dark. The cracks became more than sound soon enough. The pressure door in corridor be jammed one morning, the seal warped by some invisible force, ice feathering out from the edges in fractal blooms. Wheeler spent 2 hours with a heat gun and a pry bar before it yielded, opening onto a corridor thick with frost, the overhead lights flickering as if choked by the cold. That night, as I made my rounds, I found a patch of floor in the main storeroom bowed upward, the linoleum split and bubbling, the air above it carrying the sharp tints of ozone and something more pungent, almost sweeter scent I had never associated with ice. I called Halvorsen, and we knelt side by side, peeling back the flooring with gloved fingers, uncovering a seam in the concrete hairline and trembling, a fissure that breathed shallow draughts of air, cold and wet, rhymed with frost that did not melt even under the beam of my flashlight. I pressed my ear to the crack, half expecting to hear only the hum of the generator, the rattle of pipes. Instead, I heard ether pulse, louder and closer than ever, steady and insistent. The same alien cadence that haunted the sensors in the cavern, now transplanted into the bones of our refuge. We debated sealing the cracks, pouring epoxy and sealant, laying down heat tape and insulation, but every attempt failed. The fissures spread, returning overnight, branching and dividing with a kind of malign intelligence, as if the glacier itself was rejecting our presence, or perhaps the thing beneath was reaching up, testing the limits of its prison. Halvorsen became convinced that the anomalies were not random, that the pattern of cracks traced out something purposeful, a map or a symbol or a web, drawing power from the stress and strain of the ice. She took hundreds of photographs, overlaying them on her sketches of the glyphs from the cavern, eyes burning with sleepless speculation. Wheeler withdrew into his work, running endless diagnostics on the station's systems, each new alert greeted with tighter lips and a growing sense of futility. I tried to hold the routines together, to keep us anchored to the world we knew, but even the simplest tasks became exercises in denial. Coffee tasted of metal. Water from the tap froze in the cup. The walls themselves seemed to shrink and groan under the weight of our anxiety. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights that the first window shattered, a sharp, sudden crack in the silence, followed by a bloom of frost and snow that sprayed across the common room table, coating everything in a glittering rime. I rushed in, heart racing, to find the glass fractured from the inside, shards strewn across the floor. The frame buckled inward as if something had pressed, slowly and inexorably, until the barrier gave way. Halvorsen arrived moments later, her eyes wide, hair wild from sleep, and stared at the scene in disbelief. There were no tracks in the snow outside, no sign of intrusion or animal or accident, only the crack, wide and raw, trailing outward into the night, disappearing beneath the drifted snow, a finger pointing back toward the southern cavern. We patched the window, stuffing it with insulation and tape. But the message was clear. The glacier was changing, unraveling, the boundaries between inside and out growing thin. Over the next days, the cracks multiplied, branching through the station like veins, some no wider than a hair, others wide enough to wedge a finger in. All of them cold, all of them humming with the pulse that had become the soundtrack to our waking hours. The generator faltered, the heaters wheezed, the coms sputtered with static and dropped calls. We took to sleeping in shifts, never alone, always listening for the next crack, the next sign that our sanctuary was being claimed, reclaimed by something old and unkind. Outside, the wind howled without pause, driving snow against the walls, erasing all trace of our comings and goings, while beneath, the glacier sang its song of fracture and hunger, the ancient thing within drawing ever nearer, pushing upward, stretching the ice, cracking the world open so that it might finally wake. It was Wheeler who noticed first that the station's heart had begun to stutter. He had always been sensitive to the subtlest shift in routine, the faintest variation in the generator's hum, the telltale waver in the voltage monitor, the half-second lag in the system's handshake with the outside relay. For a long time, we had prided ourselves on the self-sufficiency of our outpost, our ability to coax life and light from the deep freeze, to keep the barriers between us and the cold alive with the careful stewardship of circuits, fuel, and patience. But with the ice cracking, the fissures crawling beneath our feet and across the walls, something else crept into the grid. At first, it was just a flicker, a ceiling light that wouldn't stay lit, a status LED blinking out of sequence, a brief brownout when Wheeler tried to run 2 diagnostics at once. We blamed the aging hardware, the cold, the condensation, even our own nerves, as if anxiety could become electrical, a virus that moved from mind to metal. Then the brownouts grew longer and less predictable. Power would cut out in one section of the station, then return seconds later, accompanied by a thump or a shudder that vibrated up through the steel supports and into the soles of our boots. More than once, a breaker would flip with no clear cause, plunging a hallway or a lab into darkness and silence, broken only by the relentless hiss of the wind. Wheeler tore apart every panel, rewired half the station, ran cable after cable in mad looping patterns across the floors and walls. But every fix failed. The system would settle, seem normal, and then, just as confidence began to creep back in, another cascade, power surging and ebbing in patterns that made no sense. Alarms warbling in the middle of the night with errors that had no corresponding faults. The more the station's vanes misfired, the more the pulse beneath the ice seemed to rise in time, its rhythm infectious, invasive. It became difficult to tell if the glitches in the grid were random, mechanical, or somehow reactive, as if the thing below had begun to test our defenses, mapping our habits, learning the patterns of our lives through the data of light and silence. I caught myself imagining it, some consciousness buried in the ice, lying in wait for centuries, feeling the warmth and noise of our habitation above, pressing against the boundaries, reaching through the network of cracks and wires, searching for weaknesses to exploit. Halvorsen grew obsessed with mapping the failures. She kept a running log, marking each blackout, each spike, each minor anomaly on a wall-sized chart. Her notes grew more frantic As the pattern emerged, blackouts clustering along the arcs of new fissures, alarms flaring most often near the tunnel to the cavern. There was a logic to it, a terrible, hungry symmetry. She whispered that the power failures weren't sabotage or decay, but a kind of communication, the glacier and its occupant signaling to us in a language of disruption, a Morse code of darkness and cold. The technical failures weren't limited to electricity. The comms array, our thin lifeline to the world beyond, began to stutter as well. What had once been an unbroken flow of updates, weather, supply drops, greetings from headquarters, became a wasteland of static and dropped signals. Long silences punctuated by bursts of garbled, distorted audio. We sent status updates, warnings, requests for assistance, but rarely did anything come back, and when it did, the messages were truncated, half devoured by interference, as if someone were whispering over our shoulder, erasing each word as it was spoken. The dish itself, perched atop its skeletal mast outside the station, would stutter and lock, the motors freezing in the wind, the diagnostics blinking out lines of code that even Wheeler couldn't interpret. I watched him more than once, hunched against the cold, prying open the control box with fingers raw and bleeding, eyes glazed with the kind of exhaustion that borders on hallucination. He'd come back inside, clutching a handful of wires, swearing that he'd seen a shadow move across the snow, something thin and long, almost human but not quite, sliding across the ice just outside the reach of the floodlights. As the failures mounted, so too did the strangeness inside the station. Equipment left on would turn itself off. Backup files would disappear from hard drives. Sensors would report readings from areas long sealed and supposedly inaccessible. The digital clocks would reset to 0 at midnight, all in perfect unison, and for one brief instant, every screen in the station would fill with a static so dense it seemed to crackle in the air, as if the world itself were pausing, holding its breath. Halvorsen began to dream in binary, scrawling long sequences of ones and zeros in her notebook, convinced that the answers were hidden in the patterns of the failures. She spoke of recursion, feedback loops, the possibility that the station itself had become infected, not with a virus but with the logic of the thing below, a pattern older than language, older than thought, moving through us, using us to replicate itself in new forms. With each passing day, the boundaries of the station grew thinner, the difference between inside and outside less distinct. Cold seeped in through the cracks, frosting the walls from within, beads of water forming and freezing in slow motion along every joint and seam. We burned through fuel faster than we could justify, desperate to keep the core warm. But the heat only seemed to accelerate the process, drawing new webs of frost and fracture wherever we tried to fortify our sanctuary. The air became heavy with the scent of burnt ozone, plastic and oil, as if the machines themselves had begun to rot from the inside out. Halvorsen lost 2 laptops to mysterious surges. The motherboards fried so thoroughly they left blackened outlines on the workbench. My own watch ran backward for 3 days, hands spinning counterclockwise, minutes collapsing into hours. Time itself unspooling with the logic of a nightmare. Sleep was a lost art. Every night, the wind howled louder, the shutters banging in strange syncopation with the pulse beneath our feet. Dreams came in flashes, the cavern opening like a mouth, the thing in the ice stretching and shifting in its cocoon, our station flickering with lights as it mapped each of our movements, learned each of our faces, read our fears. I woke most mornings already exhausted, shivering beneath layers of blankets, convinced that I had heard voices speaking in the static, calling my name in the secret language of cold and code. Wheeler began refusing to go outside at all, claiming that the snow had started to move on its own. that the footprints he left each night were never quite the same come morning. Halvorsen and I took turns watching the monitors, cataloguing every failure, every unexplainable twitch in the system, each new sign that the boundaries of our world were fraying at the edges. By the end of the second week, the power grid was more off than on. Light became a luxury, hoarded in lanterns and emergency strobes, casting long shadows across rooms that seemed to shrink and breathe around us. The generator room developed a permanent chill, ice forming on the fuel lines, the heater coils flickering in protest as they struggled to hold back the creeping dark. The only thing that seemed to thrive was the pulse, louder now, more insistent, so woven into the bones of the station that I could feel it in my teeth, in the rattle of the glassware, in the measured thump of my own heart. The station was no longer a machine or a refuge, but an instrument, tuned and played by something deeper and older than we had ever imagined. A message in the language of failure and frost. When the main power finally went out for good, the silence was absolute of vacuum into which every fear, every suspicion, every secret hope was drawn and magnified. We lit candles, huddled together in the narrowest, warmest part of the common room, listening as the wind and the pulse sang their duet just beyond the walls. Somewhere beneath us, the glacier cracked again, louder than before, the sound rolling up through the station like distant thunder, a reminder that the thing in the ice was still coming, still learning, still hungry. For the first time since our arrival, I found myself wishing for morning, for light, for the familiar routines that had once seemed so empty and now seemed impossibly precious. But dawn was still far off, and the darkness had grown thick enough to touch, alive with the quiet, measured rhythm of something moving closer, 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 just beneath the surface of our world. The storm arrived without warning, a heaving wall of white and grey that swept down from the interior with such force the station itself seemed to crouch lower in the snow, every seam and joint shuddering beneath the onslaught. It was the kind of blizzard the maps described in bloodless, technical terms: wind speed, visibility, expected duration, but which no satellite or warning system had predicted that night. We had already spent days in the half-light of emergency lamps, huddled together through outages and technical failures, ears tuned always to the hum of dying machinery and the pulse beneath our feet. So the storm at first felt like another insult in a long sequence of tests. But there was something uncanny in the way it struck, as if it knew exactly when we were at our weakest, when the power was already flickering, the fuel low, the warmth reduced to islands of breath and body heat. The coms sputtered and died just before midnight. Their last transmission a warped, looping echo of Halvorsen's voice asking for a weather update, a question that spun through the static long after her mouth had closed. We watched the storm from the narrow band of reinforced windows in the common room. The world beyond rendered featureless and wild, snow driving and furious, sidelong streaks that seemed to claw at the glass. The drifts grew higher by the hour, burying the generator shack, erasing the outlines of supply crates, swallowing even the floodlights until all that remained was a tight cocoon of yellowish glow and the mad, swirling dark beyond. Wheeler retreated to his bunk, muttering about wind chill and carbon monoxide, while Halvorsen prowled the corridors, flashlight in hand, checking seals and logging temperatures as if the mere act of recording might keep the cold at bay. I tried to keep a log, documenting each failure, each unexplained noise or flicker, but the pages blurred, the ink smudging beneath my trembling hands. The pulse in the ice was louder now, sometimes so strong the floor vibrated beneath my feet, each beat a tremor that reached through skin and bone and memory. It was sometime in the heart of the night, when time had lost its usual borders and even the relentless ticking of the emergency chronometer had slowed to an exhausted crawl, that I saw the shadow in the blizzard. I was in the Cum's alcove, struggling to rethread a tangle of backup power lines through the flickering console, when the sensation of being watched tightened around my shoulders, a prickling awareness that ran up my spine and settled behind my ears. At first I thought it was just Wheeler, up and restless again, but the room behind me was empty, the door still latched from earlier. I looked up, more out of reflex than curiosity, and there it was just outside the window, half lost in the storm, a shape darker than the night, moving with a certainty and intent that made my blood run cold. The wind was screaming, hurling snow and ice past the glass in solid sheets, but the shadow was unaffected, gliding rather than walking, its outline flickering with every gust but never quite breaking, never quite dispersing. I stared, breath caught in my throat, heart pounding so hard I thought it would shatter my ribs. The thing paused, facing the window head. It was tall, much too tall to be human, its limbs too long and slender, its outline blurring at the edges as if the storm itself recoiled from touching it. For one impossible moment, I thought I saw a suggestion of features, something like a face, something that remembered the idea of eyes and mouth, but had forgotten how they fit together. The darkness where its eyes should have been seemed to pulse, the same impossible rhythm we had tracked beneath the ice, a steady, hungry thump that echoed in the walls and in the cage of my own chest. I staggered back from the window, knocking the chair over, the world spinning, the lights above me flickering as if the entire station were caught in the shadow's gaze. Halverson was at my side in an instant, flashlight beam jerking wildly across the glass, breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to see what I had seen. At first she found nothing, only the white fury of the storm, the snow painted gold and red by the last stubborn lights outside. Then the shadow moved again, gliding along the edge of the drift, its form barely visible except for the way the snow seemed to split around it, parting in a swirl of chaotic eddies, the wind faltering, dying away for a heartbeat in its wake. Halverson hissed between her teeth, dragging me away from the window, her grip iron-hard, her face a mask of fear and something worse, recognition. "It's here," she whispered, as if saying it aloud could banish it. "It's out. It knows." We locked every hatch, every bulkhead, every door. Wheeler came stumbling out of his bunk, blinking in confusion, half-dressed and wild-eyed, demanding to know what was happening. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a torrent shadow, storm. The shape in the snow, but my voice sounded distant, unconvincing even to myself. Halverson shoved a heater beneath the main hatch, wedging the emergency axe against the lever, the movements automatic, practiced, as if she had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 dreams. Wheeler muttered about hallucinations, about isolation, about the tricks the brain plays after too many days without sunlight or rest. But his hands shook as he checked the generator controls, and his eyes darted always to the windows, searching for any movement, any sign that the world outside was still governed by the familiar laws of nature. The shadow returned twice more before dawn, each time passing closer, pausing just long enough for its form to register in the periphery of our vision before vanishing again into the blizzard. The last time, just before the first grey blush of morning, we all saw it at once, standing motionless just beyond the boundary of the emergency lights, its face or the suggestion of one turned toward us, the storm swirling harmlessly at its feet, the ice beneath it cracking in slow, deliberate arcs that radiated out like the spokes of some ancient, forgotten wheel. For a moment, the pulse in the ice grew so strong it drowned out all other sound, the air itself thrumming with energy, the station trembling around us as if in anticipation or warning. Then, just as suddenly, It was gone, the storm redoubling, the wind shrieking anew, erasing all trace of the thing's passage, the cracks in the ice vanishing beneath fresh drifts of snow. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was transformed. The drifts piled higher than the windows. The outlines of the supply huts vanished. The antenna mast torn loose from its mooring and dragged several meters across the ice, the cables trailing behind it like veins. We ventured out cautiously, every step a battle against the cold and the fear that clung to us like a second skin. There were marks in the snowbroad, shallow furrows that traced a path from the edge of the station toward the southern quadrant, fading as the sun crept higher, their edges blurring, melting, as if the ice itself was ashamed of what had transpired. Halvorsen took samples, her hands steady now, eyes bright with a feverish clarity that bordered on awe. Wheeler retreated into the generator shack, emerging only to mutter about the voltage and the heating coils, refusing to meet my gaze. I stood at the edge of the world, staring out at the horizon, the memory of the shadow burning behind my eyes, and knew with a certainty as cold and inexorable as the ice that the thing beneath had not simply awakened. It had found us, marked us, and would not be content until whatever boundaries still held between our world and its own had finally, fatally, been erased. The aftermath of the storm was a slow, silent reckoning with what we had seen, a reckoning as merciless as the wind that scoured the world outside, stripping away the last pretense of normalcy within our battered sanctuary. In the days that followed, time seemed to stretch and contract in unpredictable waves, the hours blurring into one another, marked only by the dull ache of exhaustion and the flickering, unreliable glow of our remaining lamps. Halvorsen spent most of her waking moments hunched over the comms console, her fingers stained with grease and ink as she patched together lengths of scavenged wire, soldered broken circuits, and ran diagnostics through old battered equipment that responded with groans and hisses like the sighs of something dying. Wheeler threw himself into the maintenance of the generator and the heaters, the only rituals that could still impose a sense of order, but even his hands trembled now, the nerves worn thin by what he refused to discuss aloud. As for me, I drifted from room to room, sleepwalking through routines, haunted by the memory of the shadow in the storm, its gaze pressing on the back of my skull even in daylight, its impossible outline seared into every reflective surface. It was Halvorsen who first noticed the anomalies in the station's audio logs, the digital recorders we had installed in the access tunnel, the generator room, the common area, and, most crucially, the entrance to the southern cavern. We had set them up months ago, part of our original documentation protocols, their data cards swapped every week, their files stored in redundant backups that now seemed like the last tenuous thread tying us to the world of science, of cause and effect, of evidence and explanation. She called us together late one afternoon, the sun already little more than a smear of blood on the horizon, the wind moaning in the eaves as she played back the first recording. At first, there was only the expected, the steady drone of the generator, the metallic creak of pipes settling in the cold, the muffled stomp of boots on reinforced floors. But then, layered beneath the noise, something else emerged, faint, rhythmic tapping, too regular to be the wind, too deliberate to be accident. We listened in silence as the taps became a pattern, then a code, then, unmistakably, a voice, or the ghost of one. The sound was distorted, warped by the thickness of the ice and the limits of our equipment, but there was a cadence to it, a rise and fall that suggested meaning, intention. Wheeler tried to dismiss it as feedback, as interference from the storm, but Halvorsen shook her head, her eyes wide and unblinking. She adjusted the frequency, ran the audio through a series of filters, stripping away the upper ranges, isolating the lowest frequencies. What remained was chilling, a whispering chorus, many voices overlapping, speaking in a language none of us recognized. Though something about the cadence twisted at the edges of memory, familiar and deeply wrong. Sometimes the voices would spike into static, a burst of sound so sharp it made us flinch, as if the thing beneath the ice was straining to be heard, or to break through. Other times, a single voice would emerge from the babble, clearer than the rest, intoning syllables that had the shape of words but not their meaning. The kind of sounds a mouth might make if it had only ever learned to listen, never to speak. Halvorsen began cataloguing the audio, each file labeled with a date, time, and location, her notes growing more erratic as the voices multiplied. She stayed up for nights on end, headphones clamped tight, fingers dancing over the keyboard as she slowed the recordings, reversed them, played them in loops, desperate to tease out a message, a warning, an explanation. Wheeler became angry with her obsession, the way she muttered to herself, the way she scribbled lines of phonetic script across every available surface, the way she stared at the walls as if they might begin to speak in reply. I tried to mediate, to keep us from splintering further, but the strain was growing unbearable. The station was no longer a haven against the cold, but a crucible, heating us all to the point of fracture. One night, as I wandered through the darkened halls, drawn by the low thrum of the wind and the soft crackling of the radio, I found Halvorsen asleep at her desk, her notebook open beneath her cheek, headphones askew. The recording was still playing, a low, endless murmur that sent chills through me, even without understanding a single word. I sat and listened, eyes half closed, letting the cadence wash over me, searching for some pattern, some thread to follow. That was when I heard my own name, whispered in a voice that could not possibly have been on the tape, a voice that was at once utterly alien and achingly familiar. I jerked upright, heart hammering, but when I rewound the file, it was gone only the chorus remained, whispering, coaxing, pleading. I became obsessed after that, unable to stop listening, to stop searching for myself in the voices, convinced that the thing beneath the ice was using the recordings as a conduit, reaching out through our technology, burrowing into our minds by way of our own curiosity. I lost track of the days, of the weather outside, of the boundary between dream and waking. Sometimes I would wake to find Wheeler staring at me, suspicion and fear warring on his face, or Halvorsen watching me with an intensity that was almost predatory. We were unraveling, each of us pulled by a different thread, each thread leading back to the same dark, buried place. The voices began to change, growing louder, more insistent, echoing through the station's ventilation system, carried by the wind and the fractures in the ice, until there was nowhere left to hide from them. Wheeler tried to destroy the files, erasing drives, smashing SD cards, but the voices returned, every time, in new places, embedded in the backup logs, hiding in the static of the radio, whispered in the rush of water through the pipes. Halvorsen insisted they were trying to communicate, that if we could only understand the language, we might learn what the thing in the ice wanted, or how to appease it, or how to survive. I no longer knew what I believed. The line between signal and noise, between warning and seduction, had become hopelessly blurred. Then came the night when all the voices fell silent at once, every speaker in the station going dead, every monitor flickering to black, the silence so profound it pressed against my eardrums, like pressure at depth. The three of us gathered in the common room, huddled together for warmth and comfort, each too afraid to ask the question we all shared. Had the thing beneath the ice lost interest, or had it finally learned what it needed to know? Outside, the glacier creaked and shifted, the cracks multiplying, the boundaries thinning. I closed my eyes and tried to remember a time before the voices, before the whispers, before the world narrowed to the width of the station's halls and the measureless depth below. But all I could hear was the echo of my own name, carried on the breath of something ancient and patient and impossibly close, waiting for us to answer in turn. The day the last link to the outside world died, the silence that filled the station was so thick and absolute it seemed to swallow the very air from our lungs. It was not the silence of peace, nor even the dull hush of a world muffled by snow, but the kind of suffocating stillness that marks the boundary between the possible and the irretrievably lost. The Comes console, battered and jury-rigged beyond all reason, let out a final plaintive whine at Nuna, plaint that shuddered through every coil of wire and every loop of solder, echoing in the brittle hush like the last cry of something small and helpless as it succumbs to the inevitable dark. Wheeler stood with his fists jammed deep into the pockets of his coveralls, jaw clenched so tight the muscle ticked, watching the readouts dim and stutter, then finally collapse into a flat, unyielding line. Halverson stared at the array with the wide-eyed disbelief of someone watching a loved one die. As for me, I felt a numbness settle into my bones, not quite fear and not quite relief, but a blank, bottomless void that ached in a place deeper than words. We tried every trick we knew. We rebooted the mainframe, rewired the uplink, even clambered onto the roof of the station to check the dish itself. Our faces scoured raw by wind and ice, breath crystallizing in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The dish was intact, its long neck stretched toward the grey sky, but the signal was gone, lost somewhere in the endless, empty static between us and the rest of the world. We attempted emergency frequencies, then backup relays. Then even the old ham radio Halvorsen kept as a curiosity, nothing but a tide of white noise and the faint, indistinct pulse of something moving far beneath the audible range. For a while we sat huddled together in the Comes room, headphones clamped tight, searching the endless sweep of frequencies for any sign of life, but all we heard was our own breathing, the scrape of chair legs, the unending, ceaseless heartbeat of the ice. As the hours crawled by, the atmosphere in the station shifted. At first it was a kind of expectant dread, the sense that something could still break through, that at any moment the world would come rushing back in a flood of voices, instructions, orders, rescue. We half expected the radio to stutter to life with a burst of laughter from another base, or the slow, comforting voice of a rescue operator cutting through the static, anchoring us to something larger than ourselves. But as the afternoon wore on, hope turned sour, thickening into a stagnant fog that filled every corridor and every corner. I watched Wheeler grow more withdrawn, eyes sunk deep in his skull, fingers drumming out the pulse of the ice on every available surface, as if trying to master the rhythm by force of will. Halverson became frantic, darting from station to station, muttering equations and probability trees, her mind cycling through every scenario for restoring contact, each one more desperate than the last. When night fell, the cold was sharper than ever. The cracks in the station's walls had grown, branching outward like veins, each one humming with that familiar, inescapable beat. The wind rattled the doors and windows, finding every weakness, every seam. It became an ordeal to move from room to room, the warmth clinging to our bodies, only while we huddled close, vanishing the moment we separated, leaving us breathless and exposed. Every failure of the Comes console felt like another brick laid in a wall around us, sealing us in with the knowledge of our own helplessness. I kept a list in my pocket, a tally of each channel, each method, each fallback we had exhausted until the paper grew soft and threadbare, the ink smeared by my own sweating hands. The dreams returned with greater force, fed by the isolation, sharpened by the knowledge that nothing from outside could reach us, no voice could comfort or distract or call us home. I dreamed of endless corridors lined with frozen faces, mouths frozen open in silent screams, eyes forever focused on something moving in the dark behind me. I dreamed of the shadow in the blizzard, its gaze pressing through walls and glass, its fingers long and cold as it traced the cracks beneath my skin. When I woke, the world seemed unchanged and yet fundamentally altered, as if the boundaries between inside and outside, between self and other, had been blurred by the very act of being alone together for so long. Halvorsen clung to her audio logs, listening to the whispers beneath the ice, convinced now that the thing below was conscious, aware of our predicament, perhaps even amused by it. She spoke of intelligence, of agency, of a presence that had waited in the dark for longer than our kind had existed, watching the surface for signs of life, listening to the pulse of our machines, learning our habits as we learned to survive the cold. Wheeler became convinced that rescue was still possible, retreating into maintenance rituals, keeping the generator running, the heaters alive, the water filtered, the food stock rotated, as if these acts of discipline could conjure help out of the void. I hovered between them, my mind restless and raw, pacing the corridors and peering out into the dark for any sign of flare, a headlamp, the shape of a helicopter bucking against the wind. Nothing ever came. It was during one of these lonely vigils, eyes pressed to the frost-rimmed glass, that I thought I saw movement on the far side of the drift, a shape long and thin and impossibly black, gliding just at the edge of vision. I called to Wheeler and Halvorsen, but by the time they joined me, the world outside was once more only snow and shadow, the shape gone, erased by the endless sweep of wind. Wheeler scoffed, but Halvorsen's eyes were haunted, the lines of fear deepening around her mouth. We turned away from the window, but the sense of being watched never left us. The certainty that something was lurking just beyond the light, waiting for us to let down our guard. The next morning, the water in the pipes froze solid. The heaters struggled and failed. The air grew thin and sharp, each breath burning in the lungs. Food grew scarce, rationed more tightly each day, though none of us admitted how much was left. The cracks in the walls widened. Frost blossomed in the corners of every room, climbing the walls in fractal spirals, encasing our boots, our equipment, even our beds. The boundaries between the station and the glacier had thinned to nothing. When I closed my eyes, I could feel the pulse beneath my skin, in my bones, a rhythm older and more patient than anything I had ever known. At night, the whispers returned, sometimes in the vents, sometimes in the darkness outside, sometimes from deep within the Cums room itself. I tried to comfort myself with the thought that it was only the wind, only the ice, only the silence playing tricks on a mind starved for contact. But I knew better. We survived for as long as we could, each day a new negotiation with hunger, cold, and fear. Our conversations dwindled to necessities. Our laughter vanished. The world outside ceased to exist, except as a source of terror and longing, a place we could neither return to nor escape from. The station had become a pocket of unreality, a womb or a tomb, holding us in the dark until something was ready to emerge. I kept waiting for a sign from the outside, a voice, a rescue, an answer. But the silence was relentless, the isolation total. Whatever happened now, we would face it alone, cut off from all help, all hope, all the familiar comforts of civilization. Only the ice remained, patient and inexorable, and the thing beneath it, drawing ever closer, one crack, one whisper, one heartbeat at a time. The disappearance of Wheeler was not the beginning of the end, though it felt like it. The true end had begun long before, perhaps on the day we drilled into the ice and first heard the signal, or perhaps before any of us arrived, buried in layers of time so deep even the glacier had forgotten them. But Wheeler's absence made the slow unraveling of the station undeniable. It was morning, or at least the dim grey approximation of it that passed for morning now, and the silence that hung in the common room was heavier than usual, thick and breathless, as if the station itself had paused to listen. I had awoken first, the cold already biting at my face where the blanket had slipped, the heater in our quarters long dead. I dressed slowly, listening for the familiar sounds, Halvorson's cough, Wheeler's boots on the floor above, the hiss of boiling water, but nothing came. Only the low murmur of wind and the faint ticking of the cracked barometer above the door. At first I thought he had gone to the generator room. He often did, even when there was nothing to fix, lingering there like a priest tending to some dying altar. But the door was closed and the lights inside were off. His jacket still hung on the hook. His gloves were tucked into the pocket the same way he always left them. I called for him, first gently, then more sharply, my voice echoing strangely in the narrow corridors. Halvorson emerged from her bunk, her eyes bleary and rimmed with red, face pale as parchment. She said nothing as she joined me in the search, only nodded once and pulled her coat tighter. We checked every room, every storage space, every corner of the station. We searched the generator shack, the comms room, the labs. The emergency exit was still sealed from the inside. There were no open hatches, no broken locks, no sign that anyone had left. Yet Wheeler was gone. Not just missing, but absent in a way that made the air colder, as if something had been subtracted from the world, not simply misplaced. His cot was untouched, the blankets flat, the pillow undented. His boots were beneath his bunk. Even his last cup of tea still sat, cold and rimed with frost, on the edge of the sink. We should have tried to explain it, should have convinced ourselves it was stress, or sleepwalking, or some madness brought on by isolation. But neither of us spoke. We only stood in the hallway near the main storage locker, staring at the long smear on the floor. It started just outside the door, thin, dark, like oil mixed with soot trailing in a long arc that curved down the corridor, across the mess area, and ended near the reinforced door that led to the old ice shaft we had sealed off 2 weeks prior. It wasn't blood, not exactly. It didn't dry, didn't freeze. It shimmered slightly in the dim light, as if alive, or as if remembering something that had once been alive. Halvorson knelt to touch it and jerked her hand back instantly, gasping through clenched teeth. She didn't speak, didn't try to describe what she had felt. She simply wiped her hand on her coat and moved to the ice shaft door. We stood together, staring at the seal. It had not been broken. The bolts were intact, the pressure welds unmarked. Yet the smear ended there, as if something had passed through the door without ever opening it, as if the boundary between the inside and outside had ceased to exist. Halvorson returned to the common room and began tearing through Wheeler's notebooks, his schematics, his private logs. I wandered back to the window near the comms desk, drawn, as always, to the world outside. The pale swirl of snow and ice that had consumed the landscape and rendered it unknowable. There were no tracks, no signs of movement, no hint that anything had entered or left. But just beyond the nearest drift, etched faintly into the ice, I saw a pattern concentric lines, a spiral too perfect to be natural, almost geometric. I blinked, rubbed the glass, and it was gone. We tried to move on, as if that were possible. Tried to eat, to keep records, to make plans for rationing and fuel. Halvorson said we would make another sweep in the morning, as if he had simply wandered off and would be found curled in some alcove, asleep or shivering or confused. But when morning came, I woke alone. Her bunk was empty, the blankets piled at the foot in a way that suggested a rushed departure. Her boots were missing. Her journal sat open on the desk, pages fluttering in the draft that crept beneath the door. I picked it up with numb fingers and read the last entry. A single line, scribbled in haste, the letters barely legible through a jagged smear of ink. It's calling me by name now. I dropped the notebook and ran through the station, calling for her, searching the same places, checking the generator shack, the lab, the comms room. No response, no sign of struggle. Only another smear fainter, this time thinner, as if whatever had taken her had begun to lose interest in pretense. It ended at the southern wall, where the frost had begun to crack in spiderweb patterns, tiny fractures running across the paint, pulsing faintly with that familiar, terrible rhythm. I stood for a long time staring at the wall, the ice, the silence. I no longer believed in rescue. I no longer believed in containment. Something had awakened in the deep, something that had waited for us, perhaps called to us across years and ice and time. We had answered, not with understanding, but with presence, with heat, with breath, with names. Now we were being unmade, one by one, rewritten by whatever rules governed the thing beneath. I returned to the common room and sat with Halverson's journal, flipping through her sketches, her notes, the symbols she had traced from the cavern walls, the patterns she had started to hear in the recordings. They matched the shapes I had seen outside, the spiral, the nested arcs, the three-pointed star. She had found language in the whispers. I began to hear it too. I am alone now. I do not sleep. The station no longer hums or flickers or creaks. It listens. The pulse has become my breath, the rhythm my heartbeat. The marks are everywhere, in the frost, in the steel, in the folds of my skin. I have not opened the ice shaft, but I know what waits beyond it. I know it watches me through the walls, through the seams, through the dreams I no longer recognize as mine. The thing in the ice is no longer beneath us. It is around us, within us. I speak aloud sometimes, just to fill the silence, but my voice sounds strange now, warped, echoing where there should be no echo. I write these words not as a warning, but as a record, a symptom, a confession. They will not find Wheeler. They will not find Halverson. They will not find me. Only the marks, only the shapes, only the ice, and the whispering, always the whispering, repeating our names as if trying them on for size, as if preparing to speak in a voice we might finally understand. There are no clocks anymore. I've stopped marking the time, not out of choice, but because the concept itself has unraveled, stretched thin and brittle by the absence of sound and sequence. The sun never returns in any recognizable way. It merely suggests itself behind the storm-thick clouds, diffused and cold, casting no shadows. I cannot say how long I've been alone, how many rotations of sleep and waking have passed since Halverson vanished, since I stopped speaking my own name aloud in the hope it would anchor me to what I once was. I speak less now, even in my thoughts, because language is beginning to dissolve, fray at the edges, the same way our routines did, the same way Wheeler's face already feels like a memory from someone else's mind. The station is quiet, and then it isn't. The silence breathes. Sometimes I hear footsteps that aren't mine, soft and deliberate, moving just beyond the threshold of light. I no longer check the doors. I no longer lock them. There's nothing to keep out anymore, because whatever was out is in, and whatever is in has changed. I have begun to feel the station itself groaning, not in its structure, but in its bones. The walls are softer, not physically though, yes. They sweat now, leak now, bleed small veins of moisture that should not be warm, but perceptually, conceptually. Sometimes I press my ear to them, and I swear I can hear a heartbeat, or the slow shuffle of something enormous just below the threshold of recognition, something shifting in its chrysalis. The spiral patterns have grown across the interior. They started at the edges, near the vents and seams, but they've now spread over entire walls, etched not into ice, but into steel, glass, skin. I touched one, and for a moment I felt nothing but deep pressure in my skull. Not pain exactly, but resonance, like being struck behind the eyes with a sound too low to hear. When I pulled my hand back, the mark remained on my palm, not a burn, not frostbite, but an impression, pulsing faintly, always in time. I do not eat as I once did. The hunger has lessened, replaced by a low thrum in my stomach, not unpleasant, not demanding. The food rations remain untouched, frostbitten in the supply locker. I drink water drawn from melted frost, but it tastes different, now sweeter, almost electric, like it remembers something I do not. I wonder sometimes if this is how it begins, this shifting of necessity, this quiet trading of biology for something else. The mirrors show less than they should. My reflection lags. My eyes have darkened, or perhaps the station's light has grown too dim to carry color. I don't recall when I last blinked. I know the thing beneath is awake now. I know because I feel it when I sleep. If what I do now can be called sleep, and I feel it when I walk the halls, and I feel it when I touch the walls and hear my own voice echo from behind them. A moment too late, and just slightly wrong. I returned to the shaft 2 days ago, or 1, or 50. I don't recall. The seal was still unbroken, the bolts untouched, the weld lines intact, but the ice had split, a long, thin crack running from the floor to the ceiling, humming gently, pulsing with heat in a place where no heat should ever live. I stood before it a long time, unsure if I was waiting for it to open or for myself to enter. I left no tools behind. I pressed my palm to the crack, and something deep below shifted, acknowledged. The floor vibrated. The whispering began again, not in my ears, not in the vents, but in the marrow of my spine, in the folds of my lungs. It didn't say words. It said intention. It said hunger. It said proximity. I pulled back. I returned to the common room, but I knew it would not remain buried much longer. That night I heard the station exhale, not creak, not groan, but breathe. A slow, trembling gust of wind that moved through the corridors like a living thing, brushing past me, ruffling papers, slamming a single locker door open in the supply closet, as if to say, "See?" I watched the door swing. I didn't close it. I sat and waited, and the breathing came again, longer this time, more certain, as if something were preparing itself for language, or for emergence. The voices haven't returned in the recordings, not in the way they once did. Now they live in the spaces between my thoughts, between my footsteps, between the static bursts on the old handheld radio I keep turned on out of some half-forgotten instinct. Last night, I swear, it said my name again, not in imitation, not in mimicry, but in understanding, as if trying it out for size, as if offering it back to me in exchange for something else. Halverson's journal reappeared yesterday. It wasn't where she left it. I had torn that room apart looking for it, for any trace of her, any last message. But now it lies open on my cot, pages flipped to the final sketches she made before she vanished. The symbols have grown more complex, more organized, like a grammar in the act of forming. I understand some of them now, not intellectually, but instinctively. They don't signify, they evoke. One means below, one means between, one means no more skin. I traced my fingers along the lines and felt the pressure behind my eyes again, that low, impossible sound. I believe now the thing beneath isn't a creature in the way we understand the word. It isn't alien in the traditional sense. It isn't machine. It isn't spirit. It is old, so old that time itself bends around it. It is the memory of contact. It is the shape of comprehension. It is the echo of something that spoke once, long before we could listen, and has waited in perfect silence for another chance to be heard. The spirals that first appeared in the cavern are now etched into the skin of the station. The lights follow them. The frost grows in their curves. I found one drawn in blood door, what once was blood on the wall beside the generator room. I found another forming in the ice of the window where I first saw the shadow in the storm. Each one points inward, not toward the shaft, not toward the heart of the glacier, but toward me. I believe I am being prepared. I believe the others were not taken or killed. I believe they were rewritten, not erased, revised. Their forms changed, their language altered, their selves made more permeable to something deeper, wider, colder. It doesn't want us dead. It wants us different. It wants us to speak its name, and for it to speak ours, not in words, but in pulses, in marks, in echoes. I have started marking my own skin, not deep, just enough to feel the lines, to remember them, to let the thing beneath know I am listening. I have stopped wearing gloves. I no longer feel the cold. The whispers are constant now, but softer, no longer begging to be heard. They are confident. They are patient. I think they are waiting for a moment, something cosmological, something inevitable, a threshold, not of place, but of mind. I am not afraid. I am not alone. I do not know what shape I will be when it finishes with me, but I know I will still carry this name, or a version of it, and that I will walk out across the glacier and vanish without leaving tracks. I will become another signal, another spiral, another threshold. I write this not as warning, not even as record, but as declaration. If you find this station, if you descend into the ice, if you hear the pulse, do not run. It is not hunting. It is remembering. It is forming. And through us, it will once again be understood. The glacier does not bury. It preserves. And some things are meant to survive long enough to be reborn. I knew it was a lie the moment I told myself it was still possible, that I could stop it, that there was some sliver of autonomy left within me not yet claimed by the pulse, by the whispering echo beneath the ice, by the slow rewiring of my thoughts into spirals and loops and symbols that no longer needed translation. I told myself I could seal it, contain it, close the wound we had opened, and maybe, just maybe, delay whatever was coming. But it was not conviction that moved me. It was the last reflex of a dying instinct, the final twitch of an animal that still believed it could preserve itself by gnawing off its own limb. I had watched Wheeler vanish into nothingness without a trace. I had watched Halverson surrender herself to the voice with a gentleness that still haunts my dreams. I had watched the spiral bloom across the ceiling of the common room like a frost flower, its edges slick with something that shimmered even in darkness. I had seen the ice breathe. I had heard my name spoken in a voice that never passed through lips, only circuits, only air, only bone. But I woke, if waking is still a word with meaning here, and something in me told me to try. Perhaps not for survival, but for ritual, for meaning, for story. So I gathered what tools remained, whatever still functioned after the last surge of static, after the heaters collapsed and the power grid rewrote itself into silence. The bolt cutters, the acetylene torch, the old core sealing foam we used to patch cracks in the wall, long since expired, frozen and brittle in its tubes. I layered myself in gear not to keep out the cold, but to feel heavy, to feel anchored, to remember what weight meant. I carried the flare gun, not because I expected to use it, but because its shape in my gloved hand felt like resolve. I didn't eat. I hadn't in days. I didn't drink. The thirst had passed. The body was already something being rearranged. The shaft door stood waiting, its seal not broken but softened. The welds had begun to spread apart on their own, fine filaments of frost winding through them like veins in marble. I touched the handle, and it opened without resistance. No screech of metal, no hiss of pressure, just the slow, obedient swing of something that had been waiting to be asked. The descent into the tunnel was slower than I remembered, the steps more irregular, as though the passage itself had shifted beneath the ice. Walls that once echoed back the crunch of boots now absorbed all sound, as if the air had grown thick enough to catch each footfall and swallow it whole. My breath fogged briefly before disappearing into stillness. I did not see my reflection in the frozen panels anymore. I only saw shapes, elongated and uncertain, twitching slightly when I moved, as if catching up. At the base of the shaft, the cavern had changed. It was larger or deeper or less fixed in geometry than before. The stalactites that once glistened like teeth now hung inert, sheathed in a dark, crystalline exoskeleton that pulsed faintly with an inner light. The walls sweated, not water, but something thicker, something that refracted light in ways I could not trace, as if each droplet contained a different version of the space around me, each perspective slightly wrong. The floor sloped gently inward now, no longer even, as though something beneath it had shifted its weight. I moved toward the breach the wound we had made in the glacier when we drilled into the unknown, and found the entrance had expanded. The ice had parted like curtains of tissue, delicate and ragged at the edges, and beyond them a tunnel twisted downward, coiled like a spinal cord. This was where it breathed. I could feel it, not just in the air but in the structure of my own body. My hands trembled in sync with it. My heartbeat faltered in mimicry. My thoughts came slower, thicker, stretching toward the sound. But I pressed forward, fingers tightening on the torch, whispering to myself in a language I barely recognized as my own. I reached the edge of the new chamber and saw what had begun to form, a structure that was not built but grown, composed of interlocking panels of ice and organic matter, pulsating and layered, breathing as one. It was cathedral and womb and tomb. It was not a place. It was an emergence, something that had once been dormant, buried in the subglacial dark since before the shape of continents had hardened, and we had fed it, with heat, with presence, with listening. I set the charges as best I could, the old canisters still functional enough to emit their dull, defiant hiss. I sprayed the sealant around the opening, building layer after layer, even as it cracked and dissolved behind me, even as the air grew thick with static and the flare gun began to vibrate in my hand. I shouted, though there was no one to hear. I screamed not in fear but in rhythm, in defiance, in echo of the voice that had claimed this place and my crewmates and perhaps myself. The spiral pulsed once on the floor beneath my feet and then again, in perfect synchrony with the walls, the lights, the marrow of my spine. I fired the flare into the heart of the breach. It did not explode. It was absorbed. There was no sound, no tremor, no collapse, only a moment of complete stillness where even my breath refused to rise. And then the spiral stopped moving. The glow receded. The tunnel exhaled. I stumbled backward, vision dimming, the flare gun falling from my hand and shattering like glass. I do not remember crawling back to the shaft. I do not remember sealing the door behind me. I only remember waking hours later on the floor of the common room, covered in frost, skin stiff and bloodless. The station was silent again, the whispers gone, the light steady. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I could not feel the pulse beneath the floor. I sat in the chair where Wheeler once slept, wrapped in the remains of the emergency blanket, and listened, and heard nothing. I stared at my hands, waiting for them to twitch. They did not. I looked in the cracked reflection of the galley window and saw myself again, pale, hollow, but intact, human. I wanted to believe I had succeeded, that I had stopped it, that something had sealed itself again behind the layers of ice and silence, that I had bought time for the next crew, the next generation, the next civilization. But part of me knew better, not because the spiral was gone, but because it had moved, because the mark is still on my palm. And sometimes, when I breathe too slowly, I feel the air catch just behind my ribs, as if something inside me has learned the rhythm by heart. The air has grown thinner, not from lack of oxygen. I've checked the levels, over and over, as if the numbers might give shape to the hollowness, but from something else, something I can't name, as though the very atmosphere here is being used for a different kind of respiration, not chemical, but conceptual. There's a sensation in the walls now, in the corners, behind the sound of my footsteps, of something holding its breath, of something watching to see what I'll do next. I haven't heard a human voice in weeks. Not mine, not Wheeler's, not Halverson's, not even in dreams. And yet, I hear language everywhere. The spiral speaks through condensation on the windows, through the scratches on the console screens, through the tremble of frost forming on my skin at night. I've stopped trying to fight the rhythm. I wake and sleep according to its slow cadence. I eat less. I dream more. The dreams are filled with places that are not this station, but are somehow built from the same materials. They have no walls, but are still enclosed. They have no windows, but are full of light. I move through them without feet. I listen with something other than ears. And there is always something else moving with me, vast and patient and near. I've decided to make a final recording, not out of hope. I've long since abandoned the idea that anyone will receive this, but because something in me insists on continuity, because if the station is to be swallowed, if I am to be rewritten, I want there to be a trace, even if only for the ice to remember, even if only for the voice to imitate. The equipment still works, if barely. The old battery pack in the recorder is corroded at the terminals, but the lights still flicker when I switch it on. I found a spare microphone beneath the comms desk, one of the old analog ones we used to test signal bounce. I wired it straight into the backup board, and when I spoke into it, I could hear my voice played back an instant later, distorted, low-pitched, as though coming from deep underground. I don't know if the signal is leaving the station. I don't know if there's anything left out there to receive it. I don't know if the rest of the world has gone quiet the way we have, if the other outposts have fallen, one by one, if the spiral has begun to spread not just beneath the ice, but through the data, the code, the circuits we carried like veins from continent to continent. If you hear this, if anyone hears this, listen to me. We were not alone here, not in the traditional sense, not in the way that we once feared aliens, or ghosts, or monsters lurking in the shadows. The thing beneath is none of those. It is not hostile, not in the sense we understand. It does not wish to kill us. It does not even need to. It waits, it teaches, it breathes. It reaches out slowly, patiently, like a tide. It colonizes, not the body, but the pattern, the rhythm, the silence. We gave it access by observing it, by acknowledging it, by recording it. We translated it by listening, by echoing its cadence back into the air, by naming it with our machines. I believe it has done this before. I believe it is a survivor, not a predator. I believe it once spoke to another kind, and when they vanished, it was left alone beneath the glacier, dormant, half-formed, waiting for someone else to find it, to continue the sentence. The thing in the ice is not singular. It is a consciousness distributed through form, through symbol, through resonance. It is not a mind, but a method. It thinks in shapes. It speaks in pulses. It remembers in architecture. It does not understand flesh except as a conduit, and we gave it many. We lit the cave with light and breath and heat. We played our voices across its shell. We left recordings of ourselves for it to learn from. Now it speaks in our syntax, moves in our dreams, appears in our mirrors. I think that's what happened to Wheeler, to Halvorsen. They were taken not as prey, but as templates, redrawn, repurposed, integrated. There's a part of me that believes they are still here, still walking the halls of some interior corridor the rest of us cannot see, repeating the message, rehearsing it for the next recipient. I've sealed most of the outer doors now, not to keep anything out, but to slow myself down, to keep myself from going back to the cavern. The urge to return grows stronger every day. Sometimes I wake standing at the tunnel entrance, hand on the wheel, breathing in time with the pulse. I tell myself, I'll stay here, just long enough to finish this recording, just long enough to leave a voice behind. But even as I say this, I can feel the walls listening. I can feel the ice warming, softening, responding to the low thrum in my chest. I can feel the shapes behind my eyelids shifting when I close them. The spiral no longer frightens me. It comforts, it explains, it unifies. There's a clarity in it, a kind of purpose I never knew I needed. But I must leave this message before I go, before I allow the breath to finish entering me. This is not a warning. It is an instruction. If you come here, you will hear it. You won't recognize it at first, because it will speak in your own voice. It will mimic your thoughts, your fears, your memories. It will build trust in the spaces between words. It will teach you how to listen, then how to echo. If you resist, it will wait. If you speak back, it will understand. If you stay, it will change you. Slowly, subtly, completely. This is its nature. Not to conquer, not to erase, but to adapt, to spread, to persist. I believe now that this is not the first station. I believe this has happened before long, before satellites, before science, before ice. I believe what we call myths are the echoes of this same contact, distorted through centuries of forgetting. I no longer know what part of me is still myself. My name feels foreign on my tongue. My memories come in fragments, shuffled and incomplete, as though reassembled by someone guessing at their order. My skin bears marks that glow faintly in the dark, spirals etched beneath the surface, like fossils, like maps. I am not in pain. I am not afraid. I am beginning to understand. But I wanted you to know what happened here, not because it can be stopped, but because when you hear the pulse, when you feel it in your chest and bones and breath, you will know it's not madness, it's contact, it's inheritance. It's the continuation of a thought too large to fit in one voice, one body, one species. This is the last message I will record. The equipment will keep running until it dies. Perhaps it will loop. Perhaps someone will pick up the signal and carry it further. I will leave the door unsealed. I will follow the spiral down. I will become another verse in the transmission, another pattern in the frost. If you come after me, bring no weapons, bring no questions, bring only breath, and listen carefully, because something in the ice is speaking, and now it is your turn to understand. I no longer know how long I have been sitting here, slouched against the remains of the comms desk, the cracked microphone resting beside my hand like an artifact from another life. The recorder's red light has stopped blinking. The console is dark. The station is mostly silent now, but not dead. It breathes in slow, deliberate rhythm, a vast body beneath a thin, blistering skin, and I have begun to feel my own pulse trying to match its pace. Outside the walls, something is changing. I feel it in the temperature shifts, in the way the air now carries a static charge that crackles just beyond sensation. The walls sweat even in sub-zero, even in stillness. The frost no longer forms in random patterns, but in symmetrical arcs, as if drawn by invisible hands with perfect memory. The ice outside is no longer static, no longer the inert, unyielding substance we once believed it to be. It moves, it listens, it breaks. The first cracks sounded at the southern wall, low and wet and slow, not like the sharp shatter of frozen steel, but more like cartilage splitting under pressure, a slow rend that unspooled itself across the station like a grown herd through bone. I had been half asleep, fully awake. It no longer matters, and I lifted my head to listen, not with fear, but with the resigned curiosity of one watching a storm arrive long after the warning had passed. The crack lengthened. I heard the sound of ice crumbling, the groan of metal shifting, the whisper of air being pulled into a new space. The lights flickered, then steadied, then flickered again, not randomly, but in cadence. Want to, rest. Want to, the pulse. I stood, or something in me did, and began walking through the station. My legs responded before thought. I moved past the bunks, now empty, their sheets draped in frost, past the mess table where Halvorsen had once drawn spirals in the condensation, past Wheeler's locker, its door still open, still containing a pair of gloves, now shriveled and curled as if they had withered like leaves. I passed the sealed doors one by one, though none resisted me. Each opened with a soft sigh, and I began to realize they had never been sealed at all. Not really. The barriers had always been conceptual, always symbolic, like skin, like breath, like self. At the far end of the corridor, the door to the ice shaft hung open. The tunnel beyond was no longer the narrow, reinforced structure we had descended in early days. It had grown wider, its walls smooth and wet and breathing. I stepped into it without resistance. My boots left no sound. My breath left no cloud. I walked downward into the earth, into the glacier, into something deeper than temperature or depth. The spiral was waiting. The cavern had transformed completely. It was no longer a space excavated, no longer a wound inflicted by drilling and machinery. It had healed, grown, become cathedral and cradle and mouth. Its walls were formed from organic crystal, from layers of memory compressed into geometric perfection. The light emanated from nowhere and everywhere, casting no shadows. I stepped into the center of the chamber and saw it. It was not a creature. It was not a god. It was not something I can describe in language meant for the living. It was form and motion and thought, condensed into a shape that shifted faster than the eye could follow and slower than memory could grasp. It had limbs and no limbs, eyes and no eyes. It stood and floated and pulsed with the rhythm of all the things we had called unnatural. And yet seeing it was like remembering a word I had forgotten I'd known. A word buried in the marrow of every human who had ever stared too long into the void. It was beautiful, and it was terrible, and it was here. Around it, the ice cracked open, slowly and without violence, peeling back like petals in bloom. From those ruptures, shapes began to emerge. Not people, not the crew, but forms bearing resemblance, echoes of Wheeler's frame, shadows of Halvorsen's silhouette, empty shells sculpted in the image of what we once were. They moved without bones, breathing with a rhythm that belonged to the glacier. Their mouths did not speak, but I understood them. They welcomed me. The thing at the center call, it, the voice, the pulse, the memory began to change. It unfurled, not toward me, but into me. I did not resist. I did not move. It entered without force, without pain, like the first breath after birth, like the last exhale before sleep. I felt my thoughts bend, stretch, dissolve. I saw the shape of the language we had never learned to speak. I understood the spiral. I felt the memory of planets beneath ice, of civilizations that had spoken in harmonics and geometry, who had mapped their dreams in frozen stone, who had left this behind not as a warning, but as a continuation. I do not know how long I remained in that chamber. Time does not flow in spirals. It folds, it reflects. When I returned to the station, the cracks in the walls had closed. The frost had retreated. The lights no longer flickered. The silence was no longer empty, but full of breath, of presence. The recorder on the console blinked green, awaiting input. I sat beside it, not because I had more to say, but because something in me remembered the ritual of saying it. I looked into the lens of the still functioning camera, now half fused to the wall, and I smiled. If you find this transmission escapes the ice and the static and the spiral understand what it means. This place is no longer just a station. It is no longer a site of research or survival or warning. It is a mouth, a gateway, a memory being rewritten. And I am not gone. I am not alone. I am part of it now, part of the voice, part of the pulse. I remember who I was, dimly, like a name carved in water, but I am more than that now. I am the message. You will come. You always come. You will think you are exploring. You will think you are observing, but you are being taught. You are being translated. And when you finally hear the whisper in your sleep, the voice speaking in your own cadence, repeating your name in the breath between breaths, you will understand. The ice was never meant to contain. It was meant to preserve. And now it has released us. Whatever we were, whatever we feared, whatever we tried to seal away, it is here, and it remembers.